The wind had teeth that day. It bit down through the gaps in the barn slats and found every corner of the emptying livestock yard. The sky above the auction house sagged with the weight of late winter clouds, and the mud underfoot clung like regret. The crowd had thinned to almost nothing, just a few folks lingering for deals that weren't deals, or because they didn't want to go home yet. The last of the coffee had gone cold. A paper cup sat abandoned on a folding bench, steam long since dead. And on the far side of the yard, a swayback gelding stood tethered to a post that might have rotted through had he leaned hard enough. No one looked at him. Not really. He was too old. Too beat down. One eye clouded with age, one ear ragged at the tip like it had met barbed wire or teeth long ago. His coat was sunken in patches and thick in others, and his ribs showed under his skin like forgotten scaffolding. When the auctioneer called his lot number, his voice didn't rise with interest or optimism. It dipped into apology. "Last one," the man muttered into the crackling loudspeaker. "Old gelding. No papers. No name. No starting bid." There was silence. A cough. The creak of someone shifting on a wooden railing. A breeze moved the horse's mane. He didn't lift his head. One man watched. Elias Shaw stood at the edge of the yard, coat buttoned high and hat low, the way men dressed when they didn't want to be known. He didn't shift his weight or clear his throat. Just watched. For a long while. He didn't look like a man ready to buy a horse. He didn't even look like a man who owned a proper fence. He looked like someone whose pockets were full of lint and odd screws, and whose hands remembered work they hadn't done in too long. But when no one else moved, Elias raised one finger. Just one. The auctioneer blinked like he hadn't heard right. "You bid, son." Elias nodded. "Once." "Sold," came the flat reply. To the man with a jacket older than the horse. A couple of ranch hands chuckled, though it wasn't cruel. Just tired. The kind of laughter that doesn't belong to anything and dies before it travels far. Elias stepped forward, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. Not enough, probably. But more than the horse was worth, if you asked anyone with sense. The auctioneer took it without counting. No receipt. No ceremony. Just a pat on the back and a "God help you." There was no trailer. No lead rope. Just Elias, a coat with a loose button, and a horse who hadn't moved more than a foot in 2 hours. "You comin'?" Elias asked, voice quiet. The horse blinked. Elias turned and walked. And after a moment, hoofs followed. They left the yard as the last of the sun dipped behind the grain silos. The gate creaked open with the sound of old hinges and older hopes. No one waved. No one called after them. The road stretched out pale and dusty, still frozen in its shadows. Elias walked slow, his boots crunching on salt and gravel. Behind him, the gelding's steps were uneven, drag, clop, drag, but steady. Like he didn't need to be led. Like he'd done this before. A car passed once. Then another. Neither slowed. A mile later, Elias paused on the shoulder of the road. He didn't look back. Just reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out, a small, carved horse. Worn smooth at the edges. He turned it over in his fingers, then tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat and kept walking. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and the wind had gone from biting to bitter. The house sat hunched against the horizon, all tired shingles and leaning gutters. A single porch light flickered like it wasn't sure it was still welcome there. Elias pushed open the gate. The latch groaned. The gelding followed, ducking his head beneath the sagging wooden arch. No hesitation. In the barn, there was dust thick enough to write your name in and hay that had been meant for goats a season ago. Elias cleared a corner, laid out a blanket, filled a rusted trough with water from a slow tap. The horse stood and waited. "You got a name?" Elias asked, rubbing the back of his neck. The horse said nothing. Just turned his good eye toward the sound of his voice. "Didn't think so." Elias stood for a moment longer, then unbuckled his coat, shook off the cold, and set a bucket down beside the old stall. He didn't close the gate. Just left it open in case the horse changed his mind. Inside the house, the floor creaked under his boots like it remembered him. He lit a small fire, more out of habit than need, and sat at the edge of it. Pulled the wooden horse from his coat again. It had belonged to his brother. Or maybe it had belonged to them both once. The paint was mostly worn off now, just the faint suggestion of white across its back legs. There was a chipped ear. A groove in the tail from when they'd tied string around it and dragged it behind a bicycle. Elias set it on the mantel, beside an old photograph with too much sun damage and a key no one remembered the purpose of. Outside, the wind shifted. The barn creaked. In the morning, Elias stood on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out across the field that hadn't been properly planted in 6 years. Weeds grew like they'd paid rent. The gelding stood by the fence. Watching. Not grazing. Not wandering. Just watching. Elias drank his coffee in 3 sips, then walked out barefoot across the cold grass. The sun was pale. The frost hadn't lifted. He stopped just short of the horse and held out a hand. Empty palm. Nothing more. The horse didn't move. "All right," Elias said softly, more to the wind than to the animal. "We'll start slow." That day, Elias fixed the pump. Not because he needed water, but because it was broken, and things ought to work if they can. He didn't say much. Just worked. The horse stood in the same spot most of the morning. At lunch, Elias sat on the back step and ate bread and apple slices, cutting them with a knife whose handle was more tape than wood. He left half the apple on a flat stone near the fence. The next day, it was gone. By the end of the week, the gelding had walked the fence line once, slowly, testing the ground like it might fall away under him. Elias watched from the kitchen window. Didn't interrupt. One evening, a boy from town rode past on a bicycle and pointed. "That your horse?" Elias nodded. "What's his name?" "Don't know yet. He looks hollow." Elias looked at the horse, then back at the boy. "Yeah," he said. "He does." The boy shrugged and rode on. The name stuck. That night, Elias sat by the fire again. He didn't hold the carved horse. Just looked at it. The barn light flickered once, then steadied. He could see Hollow through the window, standing under the eaves, head turned toward the house. There was a stillness between them. The kind that asks for nothing. The kind that feels like being seen without being asked to explain. And for the first time in a long while, Elias didn't feel like a man who had bought something broken. He felt like someone who had been found. The wind settled. The fire cracked once. And the house, like the field, like the barn, like the man, began to remember what it meant to hold something worth keeping. By mid-March, the frost began to lift from the bones of the farm, though the ground still held onto its cold like a secret. The mornings came silver and still, mist clinging to fence posts and the creases in the land. Everything looked faded, like the color had been washed from the world, and only now began to seep back in with the thaw. Elias rose before the light most days. Not out of duty, not from some farmer's discipline, but because he couldn't sleep long under a roof where silence was the only thing that moved. The floorboards didn't creak as much anymore. Either they'd grown used to his steps or they'd simply stopped resisting. The farm hadn't been named in years. Once it had a hand-painted sign nailed to the gate, Shaw's Reach. That had fallen in a storm when Elias was 13 and never got put back up. His father had simply shrugged, as if names were for people who needed reminding of who they were. Now the place was just the farm, not in anyone's records, just in the mouths of the few neighbors still left. The barn leaned slightly south, and the well pump wheezed like it had seen too many winters. Still, Elias repaired what he could. Slowly. Not out of ambition, but as a way of speaking back to the land. The gelding, Hollow, followed him now. At a distance. Never closer than a few steps, but never far enough to forget. He moved like something made of memory, careful, deliberate, and tired in a way that didn't come from age alone. One morning, Elias took a saddle blanket out of the attic and shook off the moths. He draped it over Hollow's back gently, testing his response. The horse flinched but did not bolt. Just stood there, eyes dim but not dead. "That's something," Elias said, patting the blanket flat. "You remember, don't you?" The horse blinked slow, like he was watching something distant and private. Elias didn't press it. He never did. Instead, he turned back to the barn and began sorting through the old trunks stacked in the loft. Dust lifted in clouds that caught the morning light like steam. Most of it was junk, ropes gone brittle, tools rusted beyond saving, a milk crate of bent nails and baling twine. Then he found the box. It was wood, nailed shut but not locked. About the size of a boot. The initials carved on the lid were faint, LJS, but Elias knew the handwriting. His grandfather's. He pried it open with the claw of a hammer. Inside, a handful of brass medals, a folded photograph, and 3 letters tied with twine. He sat down right there in the loft, knees to his chest, and unfolded the first letter. The paper crackled, yellowed at the edges. March 3, 1945. Dear Cap. He stopped reading. Cap. He looked at the photo. It was black and white, grainy, but clear enough to see the figure standing in front of a barn not unlike their own. A man in uniform. And beside him, a horse. Light-colored, tall, one ear nicked. The same nick Hollow wore. Elias's mouth went dry. He read the rest of the letter aloud. Quietly. Voice shaking not from sentiment but from the strange weight of reading something meant for an animal. You carried me further than I had any right to go. Through the smoke. Through the rain. Through everything. I don't know where they'll send me next, but I keep dreaming you're still out there, waitin'. Like you knew I'd come back. The signature was smeared. But he didn't need to read it. Hollow stood outside the barn, head turned slightly toward the window as if listening. Elias set the letter down and reached for the next. But something in him said not yet. Not all at once. Let the story breathe. That night, he sat on the back step with a cup of something warm and watched the stars appear, one by one. The air smelled of thawing earth and old timber. You were his, Elias murmured into the night. Weren't you? The wind moved softly through the bare trees. Guess that means you're ours now. In the following days, Hollow's gait improved, not by much, but enough to notice. He walked the perimeter of the field with more purpose, sometimes even trotting a few paces when a crow startled him from the fence. Elias repaired the fence line, post by post. He hummed to himself while he worked, tuneless, but not aimless. There was rhythm in it. Something between a lullaby and a memory. He hung the photograph inside the barn, just above the stall where Hollow slept. It didn't need to be explained. It simply belonged there. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by. Mrs. Henley, sharp-eyed and kind-hearted, the sort of woman who pretended not to gossip but always knew the shape of every story in a 20-mile radius. I heard you bought a ghost, she said, handing him a basket of rolls. Elias raised an eyebrow. The horse, she clarified. They said it limped into town behind you like a war veteran. He smiled a little. Might not be wrong. She squinted toward the field where Hollow stood under the maple, head bowed. You name him yet? Hollow. She nodded, as if the name fit something she'd felt but hadn't named. Well, if he's yours now, I guess you'll need help come planting season. I guess I might. They didn't say more. She left, and he watched her truck vanish down the road before returning to the barn. That evening, he read the second letter. April 7, 1945. They say peace might be coming. But I don't believe it. Not yet. I keep hearing your hooves behind me when I walk. Some days, I turn around. Some days, I don't. I hope someone kind finds you. He set the letter on the workbench, beside the old saddle he'd uncovered and started to restore. It was cracked in places, but the stitching had held. It still remembered how to be useful. Elias didn't try to ride Hollow. He didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to be burdened again. Instead, he built a new fence around the orchard, where the apple trees were just beginning to bud. The horse followed him there most days, standing under the same tree as if it had once meant something. The carved horse from his coat pocket now sat on the windowsill above the sink, next to a tin whistle and a cracked mug. Every object in the house began to take on a new kind of presence, like they were pieces of a puzzle being quietly solved. One night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Elias found himself sitting at the kitchen table, pen in hand, paper in front of him. He didn't consider himself a writer. Hadn't written much beyond grocery lists and fence repair notes. But the letter came anyway. "Dear Hollow," he wrote. He paused. "You don't know me. But I think I'm supposed to know you." He wrote without crossing anything out. No flourish. No finality. Just a few pages of plain truth. About the house, the land, his father, the silence that had crept in when voices stopped echoing through the rooms. When he was done, he folded the letter and placed it in the same box as the others. A soft snort came from outside. He opened the door. Hollow stood just outside the porch light's reach, like he didn't want to come closer, but didn't want to leave, either. "You hungry?" Elias asked. The horse blinked. He reached into his coat, pulled a piece of apple from his pocket, and set it on the step. Hollow stepped forward. One careful hoof. Then another. When his muzzle brushed Elias's hand, the man didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just breathed. For a moment, the porch light hummed, the rain softened, and the whole world felt like it had slowed enough for two tired souls to meet in its stillness. Inside, the fire crackled once and settled. And the farmhouse, for the first time in a long time, began to remember it had been built not just to stand, but to shelter. By late April, the rains came down in long, whispering sheets, never violent, but steady enough to blur the horizon and turn the fields to sponge beneath your boots. The kind of weather that made the bones ache and the mind stir. The wind shifted to a warmer note, but the damp still clung to the farmhouse, slipping under doors and into dreams. Elias had taken to keeping the second letter near him, folded once and creased at the edges. He didn't read it again, not yet, but he kept it within reach like something sacred. Something living. Hollow had begun spending more time near the house, grazing in soft circles around the porch, tail swishing gently against the mist. Some days, he stood by the windowsill long enough for Elias to see the reflection of one cloudy eye watching him from the glass. Elias had tried to mend the roof last week. 3 hours in, he found himself staring down at the rusted gutters, hammer limp in hand, the sky above his head streaked with birds heading somewhere better. He hadn't finished the work. Some things could wait. On the 4th Sunday of the month, a visitor arrived, unannounced, uninvited, and not entirely unexpected. The truck rumbled up the dirt path in low gear, tires spitting mud at every rut. A navy blue vet's insignia glinted faintly on the door. Elias came down off the porch as the engine cut off and a man stepped out. He was clean-shaven but weathered, like a stone that had seen too many rivers. Carried a small black case and a notebook tucked beneath one arm. No smile, but no judgment either. "I heard there was an old warhorse out here," the man said simply. Elias nodded. "He's around. Mind if I have a look?" Elias gestured toward the orchard. "Won't stop you." The vet walked slowly. Not out of age, but respect. As if not wanting to spook something sacred. Hollow stood near the farthest apple tree, half in shadow, half in bloom. The man crouched a few paces away, opened his case, and waited. Hollow came forward, one step at a time. Hooves silent on the damp grass. The vet didn't speak. He just watched the way the horse moved, knew where to look. When he finally reached out, Hollow lowered his head and allowed the touch. "He's not just old," the vet murmured. "He's holding on." Elias said nothing. The man continued, running practiced fingers along Hollow's joints, tracing the old wounds that had become part of the skin. "Been years since I've seen a horse with shrapnel scarring," the vet said. "Most of them didn't come back." "He came back," Elias said softly. "But maybe not all the way." The vet stood. "He's healthy as he can be." But what he's carrying, that's not something I can treat. He closed the case, gave Elias a look that held no answers, and drove off without another word. That night, Elias finally opened the third letter. The ink had faded where the paper had been folded, but the words held. May 22nd. Cap, I hope you forgive me. I wasn't supposed to leave you there. The evac came too fast. I told them you were more than a horse. They laughed. Said the army doesn't fly back ghosts. The rest was shorter. Regret hung between the lines like smoke. No sign-off. Just a half-finished thought. If someone ever finds you, I hope they're better at staying than I was. Elias folded the letter carefully and placed it in a mason jar with the others. He buried the jar near the tree where Hollow slept most nights, just deep enough to keep it safe. A small stone on top. Nothing written on it. Not yet. Days passed with the hush of grief that doesn't know who it belongs to. Hollow's steps became slower again. Not limping, just reluctant. As if every motion cost more than it used to. Elias stopped measuring progress. There was no point. Some healing wasn't meant to finish. Instead, he started sitting with Hollow more often. Not to talk. Just to share the space. He'd lean against the fence, hands in his coat, while Hollow stood with his nose low and eyes half closed. The orchard was in full bloom now, petals falling like slow snow. They made no sound as they landed, just a soft whisper of life returning in its own time. One evening, Elias found the saddle by the barn door. He hadn't left it there. It had been resting on the bench inside, beneath a tarp, untouched since he'd cleaned it. But now it sat propped gently against the wall, like it was waiting. Like it was asking. Elias looked at Hollow, standing nearby. The horse said nothing. He ran his fingers along the worn leather, checking buckles, testing straps. The saddle wasn't perfect. It was cracked in places. A little stiff. But it was whole. The next morning, just after sunrise, Elias carried it into the field. Hollow watched, ears twitching. Elias didn't approach directly. He let the horse come to him. When Hollow stepped close enough, Elias lifted the saddle slowly, carefully, placing it not on his back, but beside him. On the grass. Not asking you to carry me, he said. Just thought you might want to feel it again. Hollow stepped closer, sniffed it, lowered his head beside it, and closed his eyes. It was enough. That night, Elias dreamed of Smoke. He was not in his own body. He was younger. Somewhere strange. Boots thick with mud, ears ringing. The roar of something distant and terrible. He was running. Not on his own legs, on a horse. The horse below him was white and fast and terrified. Trees flew past in smears. Gunfire cracked behind them like snapping bones. Then silence. The dream changed. The rider was gone. The horse stood alone in a field, the sun low and bloody. A jeep rolled away in the distance. The horse didn't chase it. Just watched it disappear. And waited. Elias woke with his heart racing. The fire had gone out. Rain tapped against the window like it was trying to say something it couldn't put into words. He rose, wrapped himself in a blanket, and stepped outside barefoot. Hollow stood in the orchard, under the same tree, staring east. Toward the fence line. Toward nothing. I saw it, Elias whispered. I saw what you saw. Hollow's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Elias walked across the wet grass, knelt beside the horse, and rested a hand on his shoulder. You waited too long, he said. But you don't have to wait anymore. The horse leaned gently into him. Just a fraction of weight. Just enough to say, I heard you. The next day, the rain stopped. For the first time in weeks, the sun came through in full gold, warming the sodden fields and chasing the damp from the walls. The house smelled of wood and earth again, not mildew. The windows caught the light and threw it in long strips across the floorboards. Elias walked the orchard fence. Repaired 2 boards. picked up an old pail that had rusted halfway through. When he reached the end of the line, he saw something stuck in the wire, a ribbon. Faded green. Nearly the same shade as the service medals in the box. He didn't know how it got there. He took it gently, tied it around the fence post, and stepped back. A breeze lifted through the trees, catching the ribbon just enough to make it dance. That evening, Elias placed the saddle once more in the field. Hollow approached, slower this time, each step deliberate. He lowered his head, pressed his forehead to the leather, and stood there a long time. Elias didn't interrupt. He just watched the way the wind moved the orchard around them. How the sky turned from blue to lavender to a kind of aching gray. When Hollow turned back to the house, he didn't walk like a ghost anymore. He walked like something that had remembered its shape. Later, Elias found the boy from town sitting on the fence. "You still got him," the boy said. "I do." "What's he for?" Elias thought a moment. "For remembering." The boy nodded. "He's not Hollow anymore." "No," Elias said quietly. "He's not." The boy swung his legs, thinking. Then he said, "You should tell someone." "About what?" "About what he is. Where he came from." Elias looked at the field, where the apple petals blew soft as feathers. "Maybe," he said. "But not yet." The boy slid off the fence and rode away. Elias stayed where he was, hands in his pockets, the wind threading through his jacket. That night, Hollow didn't sleep in the barn. He stood by the porch instead, unmoving, staring toward the dark line of trees on the edge of the horizon. As if someone might finally be coming. As if waiting had never been about being found, but about knowing you were worth it. By May's close, the fields no longer wore the color of sleep. The orchard bloomed in earnest, and the grass returned in thick, untamed tufts along the fence line. The morning light stretched longer and warmer across the farmhouse, and the air was filled with a kind of patient humming, like the land itself had begun to breathe again. The hush that had haunted the place for so long had thinned into something more alive, something gentle. Hollow spent his days beneath the largest apple tree, the one that bent slightly to the east like it was leaning in to listen. He didn't wander far anymore, though his eyes tracked the wind with soft suspicion, as if still waiting for a sound he'd once known by heart. Elias brought him oats in the morning, a halved apple in the afternoon, and always spoke to him in the same low voice used for tools and memories. Not every word meant something, but the rhythm of speaking did. It filled the gaps. It made the space between heartbeats feel less hollow. On the first Saturday of June, a car pulled into the drive. Not a local truck or a lost deliverman, but a long, low sedan that bore the kind of silence only people from away carried. A woman stepped out, mid-60s, trim, neat. Her gray hair was gathered in a soft braid. Her boots were clean. Her hands were not. She stood by the car a moment before walking toward the house. Elias had seen her arrive from the kitchen window but didn't go out to meet her. He simply opened the door and let the moment come in its own time. "You're Elias Shaw," she said without asking. He nodded. "I am." She reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper, creased, but carefully handled. "My name's Claire Jennings. My father was Louis Jennings." Elias didn't speak. He waited. He wrote to a horse. During the war. Kept every letter, even when they came back unopened. Still, Elias said nothing. She held out the paper. He never stopped looking. "When he passed, I found this one tucked in a book. I thought it was just one of those strange things people do. Until someone from town said there was an old horse here. A white one. Scar on the ear. One eye gone cloudy." Elias took the letter, slowly. The paper was soft with age, the ink faded. He didn't read it then. He didn't need to. Not yet. Claire turned her head toward the field. Hollow stood under the apple tree, just as he had for weeks, as if the earth had grown him there. "That's him," she said, her voice breaking at the edges. "He was called Captain. My father used to whistle, and that horse would come running like he'd waited his whole life to hear it. They stood in silence together. No words, no apologies. Just time moving the way it always had. Claire walked into the field without waiting for permission. She moved with care, the way someone walks in a church or a memory. Hollow didn't move. His ears flicked once. When she reached him, she stopped a few feet away and whispered something too low for Elias to hear. Then Hollow stepped forward. It was not dramatic, not triumphant, just sure. He lowered his head to her hands and stood still as she touched his face. She closed her eyes, and something in her posture fell away. Years, wait, names she hadn't spoken aloud in decades. When she turned back, her eyes were rimmed red but clear. "He waited," she said. "All this time." Elias nodded. He did. They sat on the porch afterward, the sky soft with the colors of a setting sun that didn't need to prove anything. Claire handed him the letter. He wrote this one the night before he shipped out for the last time. I think he knew they wouldn't be reunited. Elias opened the paper. The words trembled but held. "Dear Cap, you carried more than me. You carried silence. You carried home. I don't know if we'll see each other again, but if someone kind ever finds you, know you were never just a horse. You were the part of me that came back alive." It ended there. No signature. No goodbye. Elias folded the letter and held it in both hands. Then he rose and walked to the tree where Hollow stood, and knelt beside him. The horse looked down, blinked slowly, and breathed out through his nose like he understood. Elias placed the letter between the horse's front hooves. "That's yours," he whispered. The next morning, Hollow did not rise. Elias found him just after dawn, lying beneath the apple tree with his legs tucked neatly beneath him, as if sleep had simply reached out and taken him by the bridle. The sky above was a pale blue, the kind of clear that comes after a storm has wrung everything out. Elias didn't call anyone. He sat beside the horse for a long time, one hand resting on the withers, the other in his lap. Claire brought a quilt from the house and draped it over his shoulders without speaking. She sat on the other side of Hollow and placed her palm over the old scar on his ear. Together, they stayed until the sun climbed high enough to paint the orchard in full color. When the time came, they dug a place just under the roots of the tree. Not deep but wide. Elias built a box from old barn wood. He placed the photograph, the saddle, the carved toy horse, and the letter jar inside. He covered the top with a sheet of linen worn soft with years. Claire whispered a tune while they worked. Elias didn't recognize it, but it sounded like something a father might hum while brushing a horse after dark. They filled the grave in silence. When it was done, Elias carved something into a flat stone and laid it against the trunk of the tree. "Captain, you waited well." Days passed. Then weeks. The orchard began to drop its petals, and the grass grew tall again. The house felt less empty, though no one had moved in. The air shifted, not cleaner, but steadier, as if something had clicked into place. Claire left the following Sunday. She hugged Elias at the gate and pressed something into his hand. "A key. It's to the box he kept under the bed," she said. "I think it belongs here now." He opened it that evening. Inside, ribbons, photographs, a worn bridle wrapped in tissue, and a journal. The first page read, "To Cap. You gave me more than any man." Elias placed the journal on the mantel, beside the carved horse and the old tin whistle. Then he sat by the fire and watched the light flicker through the window, catching the ribbon Claire had tied to the porch beam before she left. That night, the wind moved through the orchard again. It rustled the leaves, nudged the grass, and stirred the air with a quiet sound not unlike breathing. Elias slept through the night without waking. And somewhere in the roots of the old tree, beneath the petals and the earth, something settled into stillness. Not silence, but peace. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter.